A knock on the door would change everything. But to understand this story, we need to go back 20 years. This is a true story about sacrifice, faith, and what happens when you choose love over money. A story that will challenge everything you think you know about success, happiness, and what it means to live a life that truly matters. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old when she received the phone call that would alter the course of her life forever. It was a cold Wednesday evening in November. She had just returned from teaching at the local community center where she volunteered 3 nights a week. Her phone rang. It was her family's lawyer. Her grandmother, the matriarch of the Mitchell family, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. And she had left Sarah something extraordinary, an inheritance of $5 million. $5 million. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's enough money to never work another day in your life. Enough to buy a mansion in the suburbs, drive luxury cars, travel first class to every corner of the world. Enough to guarantee financial security, not just for yourself, but for your children and grandchildren. It was the kind of money that most people only dream about. The kind of money that could solve every financial worry, every stress, every anxiety about the future. But Sarah's life was about to become incredibly complicated because she had already made a promise that she had made not to her family, not to her friends, but to herself and to God. She had felt a deep, undeniable calling to serve as a missionary in Africa, not as a tourist, not as a volunteer for a few weeks, but as a full-time missionary, dedicating her entire life to serving others. For the past 2 years, Sarah had been preparing for this journey. She had attended missionary training programs, learned basic medical skills, studied Swahili, raised support from her church community. She had a specific destination in mind, a small village called Makana in rural Kenya, about 8 hours from Nairobi. It was a place that had captured her heart during a short-term mission trip she had taken 3 years earlier. Makana was a village of about 800 people. There was no electricity, no running water, no school, no medical clinic. The nearest hospital was a 4-hour walk away on dirt roads. Children suffered from preventable diseases. Women and young girls walked miles every single day, carrying heavy jerry cans just to fetch water from a polluted river. Education was a luxury that most families couldn't afford. Life expectancy was barely 50 years old. Sarah had seen all of this with her own eyes. She had held children who were suffering from malaria and malnutrition. She had talked with mothers who had lost babies to diseases that could have been easily treated with basic medicine. She had met bright, intelligent young people whose potential would never be realized because they had no access to education. And something inside her had broken. Or maybe something inside her had finally come alive. She knew with absolute certainty that she was supposed to go back to Makana, not for a visit, but to live there, to serve there, to give her life there. And now, here was this inheritance. $5 million. But there was a catch. A big one. The inheritance came with conditions. Sarah's grandmother had built a successful real estate business over 40 years. The family business was worth tens of millions of dollars. And the terms of the will were very specific. To receive the $5 million inheritance, Sarah would need to stay in the United States. She would need to take an active role in managing the family business. She would need to remain involved in the family's financial affairs and attend quarterly board meetings. In other words, accepting the inheritance meant giving up her dream of being a missionary in Africa. It was all or nothing. She couldn't have both. She had to choose. $5 million and a comfortable life in America, or a life of service in one of the poorest villages in Kenya with no financial security and no guarantee of success. Sarah's family thought she had lost her mind. Her parents were devastated. "You're throwing your life away," her father said, his voice filled with anger and confusion. "Do you know how hard your grandmother worked for this money? Do you know what she would think if she knew you were just walking away from it?" Her mother cried. "Sarah, please think about this. You can do so much good with the money. You can donate to charities. You can sponsor children. You can fund entire organizations. Why do you have to go there yourself?" Her older brother was more blunt. "This is insane, Sarah. You're 28 years old. You have no retirement savings, no health insurance. What happens when you're 50? 60? What happens if you get sick? What happens if this whole missionary thing doesn't work out? You'll have nothing. Absolutely nothing." Even her closest friends tried to talk her out of it. They sat with her for hours, presenting logical arguments, practical considerations, alternative solutions. "Maybe you could take the money and do missionary work for a few years, then come back," one friend suggested. "Or maybe you could fund other missionaries to go instead of you," another said. "You don't have to sacrifice everything, Sarah. There's a middle ground here." But Sarah knew something they didn't understand. She had tried to find a middle ground. She had spent sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. She had prayed. She had cried. She had made lists of pros and cons. She had consulted with her pastor, with missionary mentors, with anyone who would listen. And every single time, she came back to the same conclusion. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about logic. This was about calling. This was about purpose. This was about obedience to something bigger than herself. Sarah had seen the need in Makana with her own eyes. She had felt the desperation in her bones. And she knew, deep in her soul, that her presence there, her total commitment, her willingness to live alongside the people and suffer with them and celebrate with them, was worth more than any check she could write from the comfort of an American suburb. Money could build a well, but it takes a person to teach someone how to maintain it. Money could fund a school, but it takes a teacher to inspire a child to dream beyond their circumstances. Money is a tool, but transformation requires relationship, and relationship requires presence. On a rainy morning in March, Sarah made her decision. She sat in the lawyer's office, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the pen. She signed the papers officially renouncing her claim to the inheritance. $5 million. Gone. Just like that. The lawyer looked at her with a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Miss Mitchell?" he asked one final time. Sarah took a deep breath. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied. 2 weeks later, Sarah bought a one-way ticket to Nairobi, Kenya. She packed everything she owned into 2 large suitcases. She said goodbye to her tearful parents at the airport. She hugged her friends one last time. And she boarded the plane with a heart full of purpose, a mind full of determination, and a bank account that held less than $3,000. Everything she had left in the world. The first years in Mashna were absolutely brutal. Sarah arrived during the dry season when temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. She moved into a small mud hut with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained. There was no bed, just a thin mattress on a dirt floor. No electricity meant no lights, no fan, no refrigerator. No running water meant hauling water from the same polluted river that everyone else used. The toilet was a pit latrine about 50 yards from her hut. Sarah got sick. A lot: malaria, typhoid, dysentery, infections that her body had never encountered before. There were nights when she lay on that thin mattress, burning with fever, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake, wondering if her family had been right, wondering if she would even survive. The language barrier was crushing. Sarah had studied Swahili, but the dialect spoken in Makana was different. She made embarrassing mistakes constantly. She accidentally insulted people. She misunderstood important cultural norms. She felt like a perpetual outsider, a foreigner who didn't belong. There were moments when the loneliness was so intense that she could barely breathe. But something remarkable began to happen. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, Sarah started to become part of the community. She learned to grind corn with the women. She learned to fetch water and carry it on her head. She learned to cook ugali over an open fire. She learned the rhythms of village life, the songs, the stories, the traditions. She learned the names of every child. She learned which families were struggling the most. She learned who was sick, who needed help, who was celebrating, who was grieving. And the people of Makana began to trust her. Because Sarah wasn't there for a week or a month. She was there. Period. When the dry season came and food was scarce, Sarah was hungry too. When the rains came and everyone's homes flooded, Sarah's home flooded too. When disease swept through the village, Sarah got sick alongside everyone else. She wasn't a wealthy American swooping in to save the day. She was a neighbor, a friend, a sister, someone who had chosen to share their life, their struggles, their joys, with the modest financial support from her church back home, which provided Sarah with about $500 a month, and with donations from friends and family members who, despite their disagreements, still loved her and wanted to support her. Sarah began to work. But this wasn't charity handed down from above. This was partnership. This was collaboration. This was the community working together to transform their own village. The first project was a clean water well. Sarah worked alongside the men, digging, hauling rocks, mixing cement. It took 8 months of backbreaking labor. But when clean water finally gushed out of that well, the entire village celebrated. Women cried, children danced, and Sarah understood, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to be part of something bigger than herself. Next came the school. It started in the shade of a large acacia tree with Sarah, teaching 15 children using a chalkboard propped against the trunk. But within 2 years, with help from volunteers and donations, they had built a simple structure with 3 classrooms. Sarah trained local young adults to become teachers. She developed a curriculum that honored the local culture while providing quality education. Enrollment grew to over 100 children. Then came the medical clinic, just a small building with basic supplies. But it meant that mothers no longer had to watch their children die from easily preventable diseases. Sarah trained community health workers. She organized vaccination campaigns. She taught nutrition and hygiene. Infant mortality rates began to drop. Sarah also started agricultural programs, teaching sustainable farming techniques. She organized women's cooperatives for beadwork and crafts, creating income opportunities. She mentored young people, helping them dream of futures beyond the limitations of poverty. She mediated conflicts, counseled families, officiated weddings, mourned at funerals. She became woven into the fabric of Makana. 20 years passed. Not easily. Not without setbacks and failures and heartbreaks. But they passed with purpose. They passed with meaning. They passed with love. Sarah was now 48 years old. Her blonde hair had turned mostly gray. Her skin was deeply tanned and lined from years under the African sun. Her hands were rough and calloused from manual labor. She had lost weight. She looked older than her years. But her eyes, oh, her eyes sparkled with a joy, a peace, a contentment that no amount of money could ever purchase. Sarah never regretted her decision. Not once. Not for a single second. Sure, there were hard moments. Moments when she was exhausted. Moments when she felt overwhelmed. Moments when she missed her family back home. But regret? Never. She had found her purpose. She had found her people. She had found herself. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, something completely unexpected happened. Sarah was at the school, helping repair a broken desk, when one of the children came running. Mama Sarah, Mama Sarah, there's a Mzungu at your house. A white person. Visitors were rare in Mekana. Sarah walked back to her small home, now a slightly more permanent structure made of concrete blocks with a metal roof. Standing at her door was a man in a business suit, looking completely out of place in the rural village. He was sweating profusely in the heat, his tie loosened, his dress shoes covered in red dust. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, genuinely confused. "Can I help you?" "My name is James Thornton. I'm a lawyer from Boston. I've been trying to find you for the past 6 months. You're a very difficult person to track down." Sarah invited him into her modest home. Her heart was pounding. What could a lawyer from Boston possibly want with her? Had something happened to her family? Was there some kind of legal trouble? James sat down carefully on the simple wooden chair Sarah offered him. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and opened his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. Do you remember signing a waiver renouncing your inheritance from your grandmother 20 years ago?" How could she possibly forget? That decision had defined her entire adult life. "Yes, of course I remember," Sarah said quietly. "Well," James continued, pulling out documents from the envelope, "I've been going through your grandmother's estate files very carefully, and I discovered something that apparently everyone missed 20 years ago, including me, including the other lawyers, including your family." Sarah leaned forward, her confusion deepening. James put on his reading glasses and began to read from an old document. There was a clause, a very specific clause, buried in paragraph 17, section C of your grandmother's will. It stated that if you, Sarah Mitchell, dedicated your life to full-time humanitarian or missionary work for a period of 20 consecutive years, living in conditions of voluntary poverty, then at the end of that 20-year period, your inheritance would be automatically reinstated, with all accumulated interest and investment returns. Sarah felt like the room was spinning. She couldn't process what she was hearing. "I don't understand," she whispered. James smiled. It was the first time he had smiled since arriving. "Sarah, your grandmother was a very shrewd businesswoman, but she was also a woman of deep faith. She wanted to make sure that if you truly had a calling, if you were truly committed, then you would be rewarded. Not before, but after. After you had proven that this wasn't just a youthful idealism. After you had proven that this was real." He pulled out another document. A bank statement. "Sarah, your original $5 million inheritance has been sitting in a trust fund for the past 20 years. It's been invested conservatively, but consistently. With compound interest and returns, that $5 million is now worth $12,467,000. And as of yesterday, when you completed your 20th year in Kenya, it became legally yours. No conditions. No strings attached. You can do whatever you want with it." Sarah couldn't speak. She literally could not form words. Tears began streaming down her face. Not tears of joy about the money, though that was overwhelming, but tears because her grandmother had understood. Her grandmother had believed in her. Her grandmother had created a way to honor both her business legacy and her granddaughter's calling. James pulled out one more document. "I need you to sign here, acknowledging receipt of this information. And then I need your bank account details so we can transfer the funds." Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. You might think this is where the story ends. The missionary gets rich. She returns to America. She buys a big house and lives happily ever after. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Because Sarah had learned something profound during those 20 years. She had learned what actually matters in life. Sarah signed the documents. She provided her bank details. And then she made a decision. She would stay in Makana. She would continue living in her simple home. She would continue working at the school and the clinic. She would continue being part of this community that had become her family. But now she had resources. Real resources. Resources that could create transformation on a scale she had never imagined possible. Over the next 5 years, Sarah used that $12 million to build a fully equipped hospital in Makana, staffed by trained doctors and nurses. She expanded the school to include secondary education, with science labs and a library filled with thousands of books. She created a scholarship fund that sent 500 students to university. She established vocational training centers teaching carpentry, tailoring, mechanics, and computer skills. She drilled wells in 15 neighboring villages. She built roads connecting remote communities to markets. She trained over 100 teachers in healthcare. Workers. She created microloan programs that helped hundreds of families start small businesses. But Sarah never took credit. She never put her name on buildings. She always worked through local leadership. She empowered the community to drive their own development. She saw herself not as a savior, but as a facilitator. As a partner, as a servant. When journalists eventually found out about her story and came to interview her, they always asked the same question. Do you regret waiting 20 years for the money? Think about all the good you could have done. If you had started with $12 million when you were 28 instead of 48. And Sarah's answer gave me chills the first time I heard it. It still gives me chills today. She said, if I had kept the money 20 years ago, I would have been a wealthy young woman with good intentions. I would have funded projects. I would have hired people to do the work. I would have written checks and felt good about myself. But I never would have understood. I never would have truly known these people. Never would have learned their language, their culture, their struggles, their dreams. I never would have earned their trust. I never would have learned what it means to suffer alongside someone. I never would have learned humility, patience, resilience, faith. I never would have become who I am today. The money now is just a tool. A powerful tool, yes, but just a tool. Those 20 years of living in poverty, those 20 years of service, those 20 years of relationship, those were my true inheritance. Those years taught me how to use money wisely, how to create sustainable change, how to honor people's dignity, how to work in partnership rather than charity. Without those 20 years, I would have just been another wealthy American doing harm with good intentions. So no, I don't regret a single moment. Sarah Mitchell's story teaches us something that our culture desperately needs to hear. We live in a world that worships money, that equates wealth with success, that believes financial security is the ultimate goal. We're taught to climb the ladder, to accumulate, to achieve, to acquire. And if we're religious or spiritual, we're taught that God wants to bless us with prosperity. That faith should lead to financial abundance. But Sarah's story challenges all of that. Sometimes the right thing to do looks absolutely crazy to everyone around you. Sometimes obedience to your calling means walking away from everything the world says you should want. Sometimes you have to lose everything to gain what really matters. Sometimes the path to joy runs directly through sacrifice. Sometimes the universe or God, or whatever you want to call it, rewards those who choose love over fear, purpose over comfort, service over security. Sarah Mitchell gave up $5 million when she was 28 years old. By the world's standards, That was insane, foolish, a waste. But she gained something infinitely more valuable. She gained a life of profound meaning. She gained relationships that ran soul deep. She gained the knowledge that her existence made the world better. She gained wisdom that no classroom could teach. She gained joy that no paycheck could provide. She gained a legacy that will impact generations. She gained the ability to look in the mirror and know, without question, that she had lived her life exactly as she was meant to live it. And here's the beautiful irony. By being willing to lose everything, she eventually gained everything. Not because she deserved it, not because she earned it, but because she was faithful, because she was obedient, because she followed her calling without counting the cost. The question Sarah's story leaves us with is profound and personal. If you had to choose between wealth and purpose, which would you choose? Between security and calling? Between comfort and meaning? Between what the world applauds and what your soul knows is true? It's easy to say we'd choose purpose when it's hypothetical. But when it's real, when it's $5 million on the table, when it's your family and friends telling you you're crazy, when it's giving up everything you've worked for, that's when we discover what we really believe. That's when we discover what we really value. That's when we discover who we really are. Maybe you're not called to be a missionary in Africa. Maybe your calling looks completely different. But I guarantee you have a calling. Something you're meant to do. Someone you're meant to serve. Some way you're meant to contribute to healing this broken world. And I can also guarantee that following that calling will cost you something. Maybe not $5 million, but something. Maybe time. Maybe comfort. Maybe approval. Maybe security. Maybe the life you had planned. The question is, are you willing to pay the price? Are you willing to trust that a life lived on purpose is worth more than a life lived in comfort? Are you willing to believe that there are things more valuable than money? Sarah Mitchell believed it. She lived it. And 20 years later, standing in that small home in rural Kenya, holding documents that proved her grandmother had believed it too, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Not because of the money that eventually came, but because of the person she had become, because of the lives she had touched, because of the joy she had experienced, because of the meaning she had discovered. That's the real miracle of this story. Not the $12 million, but the transformation of a human soul. The discovery that when you lose your life, you find it. That when you give everything away, you receive everything that matters. That true wealth has nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with purpose, love, service, and relationship. That's the inheritance we should all be seeking. That's the wealth that can never be taken away. That's the life that's truly worth living.